Okay, why don't we get started? Good afternoon and welcome back. What I thought I'd do this at the beginning is just kind of go through kind of a little bit of information, kind of where we're at, or where I'm at in terms of thinking about the course, and what needs to happen in the next, or how things might proceed in the next few weeks as best as we can figure that out. So just in terms of lectures, you're here on Monday. I will move to using the tablet, which I haven't done before, so we're going to switch from, I'm doing it off of my PC at home, but I'll switch to using a tablet so I can actually write, since what we'll do start on Monday will be quantitative. So, okay, so in terms of office hours, just as a reminder, what I'm doing is I'm setting up the personal meeting room. I'll keep office hours at the same time we've had office hours all semester. But if that doesn't work, just send questions via email. You can post questions on LAN-CAPA below any of the homework questions. I'm checking that regularly. We can also set up phone calls if need be. And as usual, I'll continue sending out email messages. Now, semester project. Planning on continuing the semester project as planned, although I'm going to modify it a little bit in terms of when things are due and a little bit in terms of the project. So I moved the interim group report back a week. So that'll be on March 30th. And the poster and the proposal, I also moved back a week, and I moved that to the actual final exam time. And I just want to make sure that I am recording. Yes, I am recording. Okay. So poster session at this point, it's unclear what will happen during final exams. I presume all of you got the message today, or perhaps not, but that design day has been canceled for this year. That's to protect your health and the health of everybody involved, and it's unfortunate and it saddens all of us, but it does protect your health and the health of others. So that's kind of the latest I have in terms of happenings. Participation points. I will continue participation points, as I said. There actually is one posted. I posted it last night. And the question really has to do with what can I do to help you and how do we get through the rest of the semester. So that question is there, basically, as long as you answer something. And that could be, whatever you want. But if you answer that question, that'll get participation points for this week. Extra credit points. I have posted an extra credit assignment. I'm gathering links to virtual seminars. And I've got numerous colleagues that have actually sent me some links to seminars that they've done or that their departments, and I will keep posting those. So basically there's two different assignments you can do. They're about 750 words you have to write for each, and those points will get added at the very end of the semester to your final grade. So it can actually boost your final grade by a half a grade point. So that's there. By the weekend, I'll have some more information on the semester project. I will also have more information about the exams. At this point, I'm debating how to deal with the exam, but I'm actually seriously thinking of minimizing or even eliminating exams 2 or 3 and just redistributing those 40% over the other assignments, except for exam 1, that'll remain at 20%. So that's kind of what I'm thinking at right now. Watch for an email message this weekend, and we'll go from there. And that's kind of where I'm at. I put a different background so you didn't see the clutter in my house. And maybe the next one will be to guess what my background is. So I'm using my vacations from previous years as background. I'm not really, I'm in Okemos with a mess behind me. So any questions about any of this information? If not, let's just move on. So we've been talking about air pollution regulations. We'll continue that. We should finish air pollution regulations today. And then on Monday, we'll start meteorology and air pollution modeling. So we talked about the NACs and the criteria pollutants. The NESHAPs are the hazardous air pollutants. And back in 1970, with the Clean Air Act amendments, EPA was required to identify and list all air pollutants that weren't identified as criteria pollutants that would be reasonably anticipated as hazardous to human health and the environment. So just want to make sure, somehow I shut down the chat. I want to make sure that I've got that up. In the interim time between 1970 and 1990, there were 8 pollutants identified and 7 were actually regulated. The reason that there are not more regulated is because it's very difficult. There's a lot of uncertainty in that, in developing standards. So as a result, from 1970 to 40 years now, there's only 7 chemicals that were actually regulated for which standards were developed. On the other hand, EPA has identified 187 hazardous air pollutants. Now, this is a list. They're used, these air pollutants are used in determining permitting requirements, as we'll talk about in a little bit. But there are not actual standards levels developed for those 187 hazardous air pollutants or HAPs. There's actually 30 of those that are considered the greatest potential health hazard in urban environments, and those now are referred to as the urban air pollutants. So, like I said, there's 30 there. So where are we? What have we achieved? This is a plot of the carbon monoxide air quality in the US from 1980 to 2018, which is the most recent set of data. And as you can see, there's a significant range. The range shown here is the 95th percentile. The white line is the average. And you can see that there's been a significant decrease in the average and range of concentrations, much tighter now than it was in 1980. So what does that mean? We've got much more consistent air quality across the US than we had back in 1980. So it's much improved, it's much better, but it's pretty well static at this point. There really hasn't been a significant decrease in about the last 8 or so years. Why? Since I don't get to see you and I don't get to ask questions, I'm just going to answer, unless somebody wants to type in, and that'll be awesome. But basic reason is that vehicle numbers have increased, so there's a greater number of vehicles on the road. People drive generally greater distances. The federal standards are set, but they're not necessarily met over a period of time. The car ages, it doesn't operate as efficiently, and then you start to see increases in carbon monoxide emissions per mile driven. And I'll answer that one question shortly. And the other reason is that there's a greater use of light trucks, especially SUVs. So we've gone from smaller vehicles to much larger vehicles, and those are actually regulated differently. In terms of nitrogen dioxide, again, you see a significant decrease. It's not as great as carbon monoxide, though. And again, it is also leveled off. Most of this decrease is really due to the cap and trade program that was part of the acid rain program, and then later the NOx budget trading program. So it was that cap and trade that really resulted in this decrease from about 100 down to about 50. So it's about a 61% decrease in the concentrations that we're observing. In terms of SO2, again, significant decreases, much more significant though than you saw with NOx, NO2. There was about a 61% decrease. Here it's a 91%. It was easier to deal with SO2. We dealt it with significantly with two different significant changes, and one was a change in from high sulfur coal to lower sulfur coal. Most of the coal mined on the East Coast is high sulfur coal, and we've moved from high sulfur coal to more of the coal mined on the West Coast, or the western part of the US, and that's lower sulfur coal. And then the other big change was the switch from coal to natural gas. So there's a higher heat content in natural gas. There's much less sulfur in natural gas, so you see that significant decrease in SO2 emissions. Ozone, we've only achieved about a 31% decrease. And always, as we've talked about, ozone's a secondary pollutant produced in the environment. It's actually much harder to decrease and to achieve these significant decreases. We've got to reduce VOC emissions, we've got to reduce NOx emissions, and then on top of that we have global warming, and that is increasing temperatures, which exacerbates the problem of ozone because of increasing formation. PM 2.5, similar to ozone, only about, in this case, 39% decrease. It's been a challenge. Significant, produced from combustion processes, and despite all of the control technologies that we've implemented, we still see a significant, much higher concentration than we would like. It's below the national standard, but it would be ideal if we could reduce that to a greater extent. Lead has been one of the most successful. We've actually reduced lead concentrations about 2 orders of magnitude. One of the major reasons was the ban on leaded gasoline in 1978. Then finally, we just started reducing in 78, completely eliminated in 86. And what you really see is that significant decrease. As I mentioned, it's pretty much about a 2 order of magnitude decrease in lead concentrations in the air, which also means that we're seeing a significant decrease in blood lead levels. So back in about 1976 to 1980, what you see here is that the 95th percentile blood lead level was about 30, almost 30 micrograms per deciliter. The median was 15, and we're down, median is now less than 2 micrograms per deciliter. So very, very significant decrease. The 95th percentile is about 4, so down from 30 to 4. So that's significant reduction in blood lead levels in children, which is most important because of lead being a neurotoxin and the effect on brain development in small children. We've done this despite we've reduced these levels of pollutants, as you can see here with this green line. Despite that, we actually have seen a significant increase in the gross domestic product. We see an increase in vehicle miles driven. We've got an increase in population, energy consumption, and actually in CO2 emissions. So there's often comment is made that regulations cost us economically. This graph proves otherwise. 71% decrease in aggregate emissions, and yet on the other hand, you see a 246% increase in the gross domestic product. So despite the regulations, and actually in many cases, because of the regulations, economic growth is possible. So it may seem counterintuitive, but there's a lot of development that actually happens, a lot of technology that's developed because of these regulations. There's also people put into work because of this. So what have we learned? The greatest reductions were where the emissions were the highest and when they were the highest. As we've reduced concentrations of emissions, it's actually gotten harder and harder to achieve additional reductions. Cap and trade worked. It protected the environment, protected human health. There's been debate, as I mentioned, with greenhouse gases, especially with CO2 and cap and trade. And yet we've been able to show that cap and trade does work. We need transparency, we need accountability, and especially in today's environment. Okay, before I start essentials of air permitting, I'm going to answer the 2 questions that I have. One is, do you have one or two homeworks due next week? You've got 2. You've got one from before break that I moved till after, well, let's say no. You've got air pollution and greenhouse gases. So those are the 2. So you've got the air regulations, which is pretty much straight, almost entirely multiple choice. So it shouldn't take you very long to do that one. And then you've got the one on greenhouse gases. And I did say design day is canceled. I just got an email shortly before class that due to safety issues, health, crowding, presume during design day, that design day is canceled. I don't know how. We just got the email shortly before class. So those of you in 495 or any other design projects, we're all just trying to figure this out. Every day is kind of a new day, and things are happening quickly. We'll let you know. That's best I can say. I'm sorry. I'm sure it was not an easy decision for the administrators. It's something we all look forward to. It's something you all look forward to. But in the interest of everybody's health, the decision was made. So, any other questions? Okay, so let's just look at air permitting. What I'm trying to arrange is, normally I have this lecture done by an expert on air permitting. Due to everything happening, obviously he couldn't come on campus, and we're going to I'm trying to figure out how we can make this happen. If he can do it remotely, then what I probably will do is actually have him recorded, and that'll be one of the alternative extra credit assignments. So, not going to spend a lot of time on air permitting. It kind of gives you the essentials of air permitting, and hopefully if Jeff Faust and I can work out something, then I'll do something else on air permitting, okay? For those of you that came in late, what I did talk a little bit about early on is I will have more information this weekend posted about the design project. I've moved the dates back a week for both the interim report and the final poster and proposal. So the poster and proposal will be due during the finals week. At the final time, whether or not we have the poster presentation, I don't know, is unlikely. I'm gonna guess. We'll make a deal. If we have class that day, we'll have a party because things will be good. If not, everything will be submitted online, and we'll just deal with it that way. And then what I'm thinking of doing is either reducing the exams or actually eliminating the exams and redistributing the grades. Exam 1 will remain 20%, but everything else will, the other 40% will get redistributed across the homeworks, participation, and homework, participation in the design project. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so let's just take a look at air permitting. So the purpose of permits is to track information about air pollution sources. So where are they? How much are they emitting? And then also to determine whether or not a control program is successful. And it is also to evaluate future management strategies. So if decisions are going to, what decisions might be made down the road? How would they affect air emissions? The information in a permit, which is often hundreds of pages long, ensures that the regulatory agency has the information that they need, has the knowledge that they need, the documentation they need to determine the success of a control program and to determine the amount of pollutants that are being emitted to the environment. So among the documentation, you have to know, look, what are the location of all the air pollution sources? What are the types of sources? What are the types of emissions and how much is being emitted? And when we look at Source permitting, we talk about major sources and minor sources. Major sources are regulated under Title V permitting requirements, and this is any emission that, or any source, okay, that emits greater or equal to 10 tons of any HAP or greater than 25 tons of any combination of HAPs per year. So it's on an annual basis. It also includes sources that emit greater than 50 tons of VOCs or NOx. And these are regulated federally, as I mentioned, Title V permitting. And then it goes through a state permitting process in general, where it would be approved at a state level. A minor source is typically administered through the state implementation plan and may require federal oversight. Insignificant is anything less than 5 tons of any regulated pollutant or HAP. So you can see it's decreasing, and basically the amount of documentation, monitoring, etc., required for something that's considered insignificant is going to be significantly less than for a major source. And de minimis is less than 10 pounds of particulate matter, SO2, NOx. So basically those are exempt. So you're looking at trying to, for instance, you don't want to regulate a house. You don't want to regulate a really small source unless, as an aggregate, it does become a major source. The new source review process was established as part of the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments, and this is what provides the permissions and conditions to build a project. So let's say MSU wants to build a new power plant. They would undergo new source review. These are also known as construction permits, permits to install, NSR permits, or installation permits, and depends on typically in the region or the state in terms of what they're called. But they are essentially new source review permits. It's required for any sort of stationary sources. So before you can build anything, what you need is a permit to construct. And this ensures that any new modified industry is as clean as possible. It also ensures that advances in air pollution control technologies actually occur concurrently with industrial expansion. So what happens for this, in order to achieve and to obtain a NSR permit, you want to build let's say, actually in 495, we often, past couple of years, it's been a brewery. Potential significant emissions. So the first thing you're going to do, if you were trying to permit a brewery with significant emissions, you would assemble process information. What's the process? What potential gases would be released? How much would they be released? So how much beer am I going to produce? Am I going to bottle it and distribute it all over the country? Then you're going to review the regulatory requirements. So once you identify what the process is, you understand the process, you identify the pollutants, you're then going to review the regulatory requirements. You're going to start to quantify emissions. Here comes AP 42 again. So if you've never designed and constructed and a brewery, so you don't have any data, you could go to AP 42. If you're a big company, let's say, and you've got another brewery somewhere else, you would go and look at what was in that permit. What are they producing? And then you're going to compare those emissions to the requirements. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to start preparing forms, and lots of forms, lots of pages, lots of information, documenting all of those calculations that you've made in a form that you can actually present to the regulatory agency and they can understand. The next thing you want to do is you want to meet with the regulatory agency personnel. This is before you actually submit the permit application. You're going to get feedback. They're going to ask questions. You may not have the answers. You're going to go find the answers. You're going to maybe do some recalculations. And then once you've refined all of that information, then you're going to submit it for processing and approval. You can skip this step right here, but it's advantageous to do that because it'll make this process go a lot smoother. You're not going to have to wait the time to get the response back from the agency and then resubmit and then go back and forth. So it's strongly advised to actually involve the regulatory agency personnel in this process. Now, once you've constructed the facility, you want to operate it, okay? The permit is just for construction. It is not for operation. So that new source review doesn't give you permission to actually operate the plant. You need an operating permit to do that. So after construction, everything, hopefully, it's gone well. Everything's installed. And then now you're going to go through the process of applying for a operating permit to operate the facility. They're designed to improve compliance by clarifying what control technologies may allow you to do some testing, some period of time of operation, data collecting, and then confirming, and then reporting back to the regulatory agency. There may be other permits required. There are actually pre-construction, there are PSD permits, but in general, these are the two major permits, the construction and the operating. Process for this, you're going to design you've designed the process, you've determined the location, you've prepared your construction installation permit, you've gotten that permit, you've built the process. Now you're going to, as I mentioned, now you're going to verify compliance, and then you're going to request the operating permit. You're going to be given that operating, hopefully, permit, or you're going to be told that you have to modify that process. Perhaps you have to reduce the production rate, or you have to put in additional control equipment in order to operate at full operational mode. The third type are the opt-out permits. Now, when you get a operating permit, the assumption is that you're going to operate at full capacity 24/7. That may not be the case. There are permits, basically, these cap total emissions. So perhaps you're going to design it to operate at full capacity, but you don't believe you're going to need to, and you're going to design it, let's say, to only operate for 2 shifts, 5 days a week. So you're going to reduce emissions. That restricts the facility from operating at full capacity. So it's restricting the growth, it's restricting productivity, but it allows you to bypass, in some cases, some of the requirements for these major source permits. And because it's reducing productivity, it's reducing emissions. The challenge is if it's just creating an emission somewhere else, is it really just build another smaller facility somewhere else? is it truly reducing emissions? Perhaps regionally, but not globally. We talked previously about state implementation plans. State implementation plans should be seen as part of enforcement. It is what gives the state the authority to enforce pollution control systems. So it's because of these state implementation plans that a state can gather information about construction modifications, can gather this information about sources, and can determine requirements for monitoring, record keeping, reporting, and then can implement systems for detecting. So for instance, at Michigan State, typically in about February, March, at the power plant, they hire a outside company to come in and calibrate all of their monitoring equipment on the stacks. That provides documentation that they're not fudging the numbers, essentially, that what they're actually measuring is accurate. It's what we think it is, and somehow they're not, like I said, not fudging the numbers in order to meet the permit requirements. We also talk about compliance monitoring, and there really are two types of compliance monitoring: self-monitoring and compliance inspection. So this is the system used by regulatory agencies to determine that laws and regulations are being followed. Self-monitoring, what I just described would be self-monitoring, okay? Every day, actually, continuously for many chemicals, there's data being collected at the stack at the power plant. It's collected, it's recorded, it's evaluated in order to ensure compliance. And the idea is that if something is out of compliance, then the company responds. So MSU is responsible for determining if the baghouse filters are not operating properly, what needs to be done in order to come back into compliance, for example. They have to maintain the records, and then they report to the state agency. So the onus is on the operator, and what information they need to provide is in the permit. So the permit would specify intervals for sampling, what methods need to be used, and how that these have to be approved methods, what calibration, how often they need to calibrate, what data they need to record, and how often they need to submit that to the regulatory agency. And then there's compliance inspections. So here, now the agency visits, agency personnel visits the industry, and they are then assessing the compliance status. They're collecting evidence of any specific violations, and it also creates a visible presence and hopefully therefore deters violations. Now, there's no way that there's sufficient number of personnel to inspect all the facilities on a routine basis, so priority is placed on these inspections, and it's really based on a likelihood. So if a violation would cause risk to human health and the environment. About a month ago, there was that in the news, green ooze was had appeared on, I forget which highway it was in Detroit. It was actually from an electroplating operation which had been shut down, but that was one that, based on its significant operational issues, would have been one that probably would have been inspected on a fairly routine basis. One of the concerns was volatile chemicals from this, volatilization from some of these chemicals in that material that was oozing onto the highway. So again, you're going to send the personnel out, the regulatory personnel out to determine whether or not a violation is committed. Another is history of violations. A company that has a history of violations, it's more likely to see an inspector than one that hasn't. And would that inspection deter further violations or a violation? Then it's more likely. So thing also to think about is compliance at a facility level does not mean attainment at a state level. So we talked about attainment and non-attainment. Compliance and attainment are very different. So it's important to keep those concepts separate. And I forgot to move that, so I'm gonna, and then lastly, if there is a violation, then we move into enforcement. So regulatory personnel has either detected a violation from the record keeping or they've actually observed a violation. So the goal of enforcement is to correct that violation as soon as possible, deter any future violations, be fair to the regulated community. You want to make sure that, you know, any enforcement that's done is unbiased, is nonpartisan, is you've got similar enforcement for similar actions so that there's not one company gets $50,000 worth of fines, but the other company for the same violation only gets $5,000. You want similar sanctions placed for similar crimes or violations. You want to effectively use enforcement resources to protect human health. So if you've got an operation that has been compliant, you have no reason to, from the record keeping, to assume that there is a violation, but you've got one that you've got some questions about. You want to go to the one that you have some questions about, because that you're looking at protecting human health and the environment. In terms of responses, these can be informal. They can be a warning letter, and they can be formal. They can be legal action. They can be shut down. They can be a administrative penalty up to $25,000 per day for a violation. It could be a field ticket, which is up to $5,000 per for any violation discovered. So there's different responses that can occur, and it really depends on the severity of the violation and the impact on human health and the environment. So I'll end there. If anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. There is a participation question today. It's basically question how I can help you either as your instructor or as the associate chair for civil and environmental engineering in a time of uncertainty and challenges. So, and if you don't want to say anything, just reply hi, or whatever you wish to reply. And then that's to get the participation points for that. And you've got until tonight at 11:59. Again, there's 2 homeworks due. They're due on Wednesday. I moved both to Wednesday. And the homework on regulations is pretty much all multiple choice. There's a couple kind of ordering, but they're straight off the slides. So they shouldn't take a whole lot of time to get through those slides, that homework. Any questions? Okay. Barring no questions, we will end here.